In the heart of the frontier, where the sun bled fire across endless plains and the silence of the desert carried both danger and promise, there lived a cowboy named James Calder, a man hardened by years of riding under merciless skies and surviving on grit, sweat, and an iron will. James was no stranger to loneliness. He lived in a modest barn he had built with his own hands, tucked away against the backdrop of towering mesas and wide rivers that cut through the land like veins of silver. His life was simple: cattle, horses, and the occasional trip into town for supplies. But beneath his rugged exterior lay a heart that still remembered kindness, though it had rarely been shown to him. One fateful evening, as the sun was sliding down and painting the horizon with streaks of blood orange and gold, James noticed movement in the tall grass near his barn. He approached cautiously, his hand resting on the revolver at his hip, but what he found stopped him in his tracks. A small native child, frail and trembling, collapsed in the dirt with eyes that spoke of hunger and days without food. The boy's lips were cracked, his cheeks sunken, his little body nothing but bones wrapped in torn cloth. Without hesitation, James bent down, lifted the child into his arms, and carried him inside the barn. He cooked the last of his beans over a small fire, softened bread in water so the boy could swallow, and stayed by his side until the child fell into a deep, exhausted sleep. For the first time in years, James felt something stir within him, something more powerful than survival: compassion. What he did not know was that this single act of mercy would change the course of his life forever. When dawn broke, James expected nothing more than another day of labor. But as he stepped out of the barn, his eyes widened in disbelief. Stretching before him was a sight that seemed pulled from legend. 200 native warriors on horseback, their faces stern, their eyes fixed upon him. They filled the land like an ocean of riders, their presence so immense that the earth seemed to quake beneath the hooves of their horses. At the front stood their leader, adorned with a magnificent headdress of white feathers, his posture commanding yet calm. The child James had saved stood beside him, now strong enough to hold onto the reins of a small pony, his tiny eyes filled with awe and gratitude. The warriors were silent, but their silence was more deafening than thunder, for it carried a weight James could not measure. He swallowed hard, unsure if he was facing his last sunrise. He had heard tales of brutal reprisals, of cowboys and settlers clashing with the tribes, but in this moment, standing before a sea of 200 armed men, he realized he was not facing vengeance, he was standing before judgment. The chief dismounted slowly, his footsteps deliberate as he approached James. Every warrior behind him remained still as statues, their presence like the wall of a living fortress. The chief spoke in a low, steady voice, words that carried the force of wind sweeping through canyons. Through broken English, he revealed the truth. The child James had saved was his grandson, lost for days and feared dead. While others would have turned away, James had chosen kindness, giving what little he had to a starving boy who could offer nothing in return. The chief looked deeply into James's eyes, and for a long moment, time seemed suspended between them. Two men from worlds divided by history, distrust, and blood, yet bound in that instant by something greater, the recognition of humanity. Then, as if moved by an unseen command, 200 warriors raised their spears high, not in threat but in salute. The ground shook as their horses pawed the earth, a gesture of honor so profound that James felt his chest tighten with emotion. The chief declared that James Calder was now under the protection of his people. No man would raise a hand against him, for he had proven himself not by strength of arms but by strength of heart. In the days that followed, James's life transformed in ways he could never have imagined. Where once his barn stood alone in the wilderness, now it became a place of gathering, a bridge between two worlds. The warriors visited often, bringing gifts of food, hides, and stories from their tribe. James, in return, shared his knowledge of farming, horses, and tools. Around his fire, cowboys and natives sat together, speaking not with suspicion but with curiosity, finding that they were not so different after all. For James, the greatest reward was the laughter of the child he had saved, running through the fields with a strength and joy that reminded him why compassion was the greatest weapon a man could wield. And though he had lived a life defined by solitude, James discovered that one act of kindness could echo farther than the crack of a rifle or the gallop of 1,000 horses. Yet the story of James Calder is more than just history. It is a lesson for all who hear it. In a world where division often seems stronger than unity, Where pride and fear can blind us to the suffering of others, his choice stands as a beacon that the smallest act of mercy can disarm armies and win battles no weapon ever could. When James fed a starving child, he did not know 200 warriors would appear at his barn the next morning. But what he did know was that doing what is right, even when it costs you something, is never in vain. His story reminds us that power does not lie in dominance but in kindness. For kindness multiplies in ways we cannot see until the day it returns to us like an ocean rising. And to you, listening now, let this tale burn in your heart. Remember that greatness is not in what you own or how loud your voice is, but in what you give when no one is watching. If a cowboy alone on the frontier could change the course of his life and earn the respect of an entire people through a single meal shared with a starving child, imagine what you can do in your own world, in your own struggles, in your own journey. Every choice you make plants a seed, and one day, that seed may grow into a forest of blessings you never expected. So if this story moved you, if it lit even a spark inside you, then carry it forward. Live with courage, live with compassion, and remember that your kindness today may be the reason an army of blessings stands before you tomorrow. And before you go, don't forget to subscribe to this channel, because together, we'll continue to share stories that remind us of the strength within us all. Stories that ignite hope, courage, and compassion in a world that needs it now more than ever. The days that followed James Calder's unexpected bond with the tribe were like the slow unfolding of a legend, the kind of tale whispered around firesides and carried on the wind to towns that doubted miracles still existed. For the man who once lived alone now found himself at the center of a story far larger than anything he could have imagined. And though the bond between him and the warriors was forged by compassion, it would soon be tested by fire, for peace on the frontier was never permanent and greed was always near. It began with the arrival of strangers, men from the town who had long eyed the fertile stretch of land James called home, their voices sharp with the arrogance of men who thought the land was theirs for the taking. Their eyes narrowed with disdain when they saw the native riders who now visited James openly, their presence a living challenge to the men's hunger for control. They accused James of betrayal, of siding with enemies instead of his own kind, and though James tried to explain that kindness was no betrayal, that respect could exist where once there was suspicion, his words fell on deaf ears. These men, dressed in dusty coats with rifles slung across their shoulders, had no room in their hearts for peace. They saw only threats, only land to conquer, only people to subdue. Tension rose like the desert heat, heavy and suffocating until one night shots rang out in the distance, breaking the silence like glass. James woke to find smoke rising from a ridge not far from his barn, and when he rode out he discovered that one of the tribe's camps had been burned, their horses scattered, their food supplies destroyed. Rage boiled in the hearts of the warriors, and James stood in the middle of a storm that threatened to consume everything. He could see it in their eyes, the fire of vengeance ready to blaze, the weight of generations of betrayal pressing on them like iron chains, and for a moment he feared that nothing could stop the bloodshed that was about to begin. But then the child he had saved stepped forward, small but unshaken, his gaze fixed on James as though silently asking him what they should do. James felt the gravity of the moment, the pull of history urging violence, but he also remembered that his single act of kindness had once changed the course of fate, and perhaps it could again. He spoke with a voice that carried not command but conviction, telling the warriors that vengeance would only prove their enemies right, that their honor was greater than hatred, that strength was not measured in how many they could kill, but in how long they could endure without losing the truth of who they were. The chief listened, his face unreadable, and after a long silence, he ordered his warriors to stay their hands, to wait, to let wisdom guide them rather than anger. It was a decision that stunned even James, for he knew how deep the wounds ran, but it showed him that the bond between them had become something unbreakable, something powerful enough to hold back the tide of war. Still, the enemy did not rest. The men from town gathered others, greedy ranchers and lawless gunslingers, and soon a small army marched toward James's land, determined to drive out both him and the tribe that now stood beside him. On the morning they arrived, the horizon filled with dust once again, but this time it was not the tribe who came. It was men with rifles, greed gleaming in their eyes, and they came with the promise of fire and blood. James stood before his barn, the same place where he had first faced 200 warriors, and now he faced another army. But this one carried no honor, no unity, only hunger for power. He felt fear, but he also felt something greater, a resolve born of knowing that he was no longer alone, that behind him were not just allies, but family forged by choice and sacrifice. As the armed men approached, ready to burn his home to the ground, the warriors emerged from the shadows of the land, riding in silence, their presence like a wall of unshakable stone. 200 horses, 200 hearts, and the chief at their front, his feathers glowing in the morning sun like a crown of fire. The two sides faced each other in silence, the air so thick with tension it could be cut with a blade. The men from town shouted threats, raised their guns, spat words meant to provoke, but the warriors did not flinch, and James did not step back. He rode forward, his voice carrying across the plain, telling the intruders that they would find no easy victory here, that this land was not theirs to claim, that what stood before them was not one man and a tribe, but a force bound by something they could never understand, loyalty born of compassion, trust born of sacrifice. The men hesitated, uncertain in the face of such unity, and though their guns could kill, their spirits faltered, for they saw in James and the warriors a strength that no bullet could pierce. In the end, they turned back, not because they could not fight, but because they realized that to fight would mean more than death. It would mean the crushing of their pride, the recognition that they were weaker than the bond they faced. That night, around the fire, James sat with the tribe, the child asleep beside him, the warriors sharing stories of their ancestors, and he realized something he had never felt before, that home was not built of wood or land, but of people who stood with you when the world turned against you. His barn, once a lonely shelter, had become a sanctuary of unity, and he knew that no matter what challenges came, he would never face them alone again. And though history would forget the names of many who lived and died on the frontier, it would never forget the cowboy who fed a starving child, and in doing so gained not only the respect of 200 warriors, but a legacy of peace carved into the heart of the land. And so, to you listening now, let this chapter remind you that life will test you, that enemies will come, that the fire of struggle will burn hot against your spirit, but strength is not found in how hard you can strike. It is found in how steadfastly you can stand for what is right, even when the world demands you yield. Remember that compassion is not weakness. It is the shield that turns back armies, the torch that lights the darkest nights, the bridge that unites enemies into family. If this story speaks to you, if it stirs even the smallest ember inside your heart, then do not let that ember fade. Carry it with you. Let it guide your choices. Let it shape the way you treat others, for you never know when a single act of kindness may return to you as an army of blessings. And before you go, don't forget to subscribe to this channel, because every story we share here is meant to strengthen your heart, inspire your journey, and remind you that even in the harshest deserts of life, hope and unity can rise like a tide no force can stop.